Hayley and I moved to Scotland with some friends actually to set up a youth festival, which we called Imagine. And it ran for 9 years every summer. We had up to about 1,000 young people come and camp for 4 days, 5 days. And we would worship in song felt like for hours and hours. And we'd have kind of interesting talks, and we'd pray for each other and all sorts of other things, skate park and talent shows and Kayleys and all sorts of stuff. And it was great. And most importantly, we met with Jesus. A whole bunch of young people for 9 years met with Jesus. And actually, it finished in 2013, the year that we came down here. And then we handed it on to Soul Survivor. It became Soul Survivor Scotland. Soul Survivor folded in 2019, not folded, decided to shut down in 2019. And in Scotland, it's become this thing called Magnitude, which actually our Bethan was playing drums at this summer. So isn't that a lovely little thing? It's like we set up this festival, and our festival had a grandbaby, and Bethan's playing drums at it. So anyway, you didn't need to know that bit. What you did need to know is that we weren't paid. We employed an administrator for, I think, probably 10 hours a week for a few of those years, which made it enormously helpful. But the rest of us were all volunteers. And when we came to the week with all these young people turning up from all over Scotland, we needed loads of help, loads of volunteer help. And so lots of people did all sorts of helpful things. But perhaps the most helpful, certainly the largest group of volunteers, was a group of stewards. Have you been to a Christian event like that where there's lots of stewards? Yeah. And so they would count people in and out of venues. They'd keep fire safety checks. They would move things. They did a lot of moving things around, carrying things from one place to another. They cleaned the showers and the toilets even, all sorts of stuff. And in return for doing that, they didn't have to pay to come to Imagine. They just had to do these few shifts on this team. And we gave them 3 decent meals. We were running this in an agricultural centre, like a cattle market in Aberdeenshire. And I tell you, the best place to get 3 decent meals is the Farmers Market Cafe. So we fed them well 3 times a day while they were there, but no money. But we also gave them one of these, a fluorescent jacket. We gave them a fluorescent jacket. So all of the stewards wore one of these. Some of them, really important stewards, also had like a CB radio as well. But you know, you had to be high up in the world of stewarding to get one of those. So they wore these fluorescent jackets. And whenever they put one of these fluorescent jackets on, it was as if something changed in them. Can you imagine this? Have you seen that scene, Harry Enfield, wasn't it? Kevin and Perry, the moment they become teenagers and they completely change. Do you remember that? It was a bit like that with one of these yellow jackets. As soon as you put on a yellow jacket, what was a perfectly delightful, charming Christian person suddenly becomes something slightly different. How do they change? Do you know what I mean? They suddenly become really committed to doing everything by the book. They might have been quite relaxed before, but suddenly it really matters that everything's done just right, the way they're told, just according to the rules as it should be. They suddenly become really, really pernickety. They suddenly really care about order. They actually become quite legalistic. In fact, you could say some of them become little autocrats. You can't walk there, like that, in that tone of voice. You can't sit like that. You can't get down off there. Do you know what I mean? Some of you are laughing because, yeah, that's exactly what happens when somebody puts on one of these jackets. The main worship space, there weren't chairs because we were young, so we sat on the floor or we stood up and bounced and danced or whatever else. And so we had to mark out like aisles for fire safety or something like that. And I tell you, if you're sat next to one of these marks on the floor there and your shoelace is slightly touching that line, a steward would come running up to you, "That's in the aisle," like that. That's what happened when they put these fluorescent jackets on. In fact, it got so bad, we had to do something about it. And what we did was we came up with this program called Hug a Steward Day. Okay, and so one day of the week, we would tell all the young people, whenever they saw a steward, to go and hug them. And what we would tell them was, oh, the stewards are working so hard. They're doing all this stuff for you. They're even cleaning the toilets every now and then. They're even making sure some of the showers have water in them and occasionally it's warm. They're doing all of this stuff. You need to thank them by giving them a hug. That's what we told them we were doing. Actually, that's not what we were doing. What we were doing was reminding the stewards that they were still human, even in their jacket. And even in their jacket, they could still receive love and give love. Didn't just need to be these people who did everything by the book. I'm going to take this off. Is that all right? Where shall I put it? Up here. Leslie and I had a discussion because she hadn't learned a sign for fluorescent jacket. Can you show us what it is now? Yeah, very good. Orange. So the fact that mine's yellow doesn't matter. It seems to me that there's a human drive, and you see it in lots of people. I think we see it in ourselves, sometimes more than others. This human drive for rules, for legalism. We have this drive for order, for predictability. And we see it in that story of Jesus and the crippled woman, don't we? The religious leader, the leader of the synagogue, he's got his rules, he's got his legalism to such a degree that he can't even see the suffering of this woman. He's missed this woman's suffering, perhaps for 18 years. All he can see is the rules. And so when Jesus comes in and sets her free from the chains of her sickness, from this crippling illness she's got, all he can say is, no, 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 that's not how you do it. Not like that. Not now. This should happen tomorrow. You've crossed the line, Jesus. You can do your miracles and follow the rules. He's just become blind to God in front of him and the compassion of God. Why would it be that he's faced with the living God? Jesus, the living God, is in front of him, and yet he would rather choose his religious rules, his religious system. And why would we do the same? Why would we choose rule keeping over life? Why would we, faced with the living God, place our hope in a system of religious rules? That's not a rhetorical question. I'm going to answer that question for you. I'm going to tell you why the synagogue leader places his hope in rules instead of in relationship with the living God. And it's the same for us. This is the same reason why we do the same. And there's two things, okay, here. The first thing is we want to protect ourselves from God, who we fear is too much for us. We want to protect ourselves from God, who we fear is too much for us. And the second reason we choose rules over relationship with God is because we want to look good. Okay? So the first reason is about protecting ourselves, and the second reason is about promoting ourselves. In the reading we just heard from Hebrews, the writer there is talking about Sinai, is talking about Moses receiving the 10 Commandments on Sinai, isn't he? And do you remember what happened then? All of the people said to Moses, oh, no, this God's far too frightening. You go for us. We'll stay here. You go for us. You bring back some rules for us. We don't want to face up to God. We'd just rather that you go stand in for us and bring us the rules for us. They're afraid that God might demand too much of them. They're afraid that if they encounter God, they might never be the same again. Do you ever come before God and feel afraid like that? Are you afraid that God might ask too much from you, or that God might meet you and you'll never be the same? I think we probably do fear that, don't we? Sometimes if we don't, perhaps we're not being honest all the time. Or maybe we're like those people who the letter to the Hebrews is addressed to. And the big theme in that letter is that they're tempted to go back to what's comfortable, to what's familiar. You know, they've got a glimpse of God in all of his glorious freedom and all of his power, like C.S. Lewis talked about God, who's a bit like a tame lion. They've got a glimpse of that, but they're tempted to go back to what they know, what's familiar, what's comfortable, the rules that they know. It's a bit like they've tasted this wonderful wine and they say, I think I'd rather have the water. Or they've seen the glorious light of God, but then they say, actually, I'd rather just turn back to the little light that I find in me. And so they're tempted to turn back to their religious conventions and their law. They choose rules over relationship. It's as if they're saying, I just need a list of things to do. If you give me the list of things to do, then that will keep God off my back. And I think that we do the same again ourselves. Just tell me what I'm supposed to do, and it will keep God off my back. And it's no wonder we would do that, because the reading finished there by telling us that God is a consuming fire. And if you remember, the Bible invites us to die to ourselves and have our lives raised up in Christ. It invites us to hide ourselves in Jesus, hide our lives in him. And perhaps Jesus might come to you and ask you to sell all you have and give to the poor. Maybe Jesus might come to you and say, leave everything behind and follow me. Or maybe he might send you to some distant part of the world in mission. Maybe he might ask you to love your enemies or forgive the people around you. Or maybe you might find yourself on a horse on the way to Damascus, and he'll knock you off your horse and completely turn your world upside down. Or maybe he might ask you to give up a bad habit. Or maybe he might ask you to notice a crippled woman and have compassion, even though it's socially awkward to do that. So we can use a whole bunch of religious rules to protect ourselves, to give ourselves space from God. And so, we might say, oh, I went to church on Sunday, and that means I don't need to do anything else for Jesus this week. Or I know that God speaks to me through the Bible, so I don't need to listen for his voice in the words of my friends or in anything else that's going on for me. Or I show the love of Jesus in my actions, and therefore I don't actually need to talk to anybody about Jesus and his love. Or I've given my tithe, I've given God some of my money, and therefore he doesn't have a say in what I do with the rest of my money and the rest of my resources and my time. Does that make sense? Can you imagine doing any of those things? You might be able to think of better examples, the ways in which you use religion or religious laws to reduce God's claim upon you, that the way that you choose legalism to keep God distant, to keep God in a box, because the fact is that God is infinitely free and surprising. And if we're honest, that's unsettling. That's frightening to us. That's what's going on for this religious leader, I think, in the synagogue. God has pitched up on a Sabbath morning and set this woman free. And all he can think is, that's not how the rules say it should happen. He'd rather stick with his familiar rules than encounter the living God. He wants God to stay in the box that he's put him in. And so he's been blinded by his religion, and he doesn't see and he can't celebrate this life-giving work of God, even though he claims this is the God that he worships. And, we read that story and it's easy for us to look at that man and think, you Wally, you missed it. How did you manage to miss that? But I think we can be honest and recognize that impulse to return to rules, to return to legalism, to put on the fluorescent jacket and feel comfortable in having a role, that impulse is in all of us as well. So I think we use religious rules, we use legalism to protect ourselves, to keep God at a distance, to protect ourselves from the constant challenge that God brings to us, from the absolute demands that he makes upon us. And instead we hide behind this picture of God who is predictable and safe, rather than the real God who is surprising and wondrous and can do anything he wants and can ask of us anything that he wants. Are you with me so far? Why we might choose legalism is to keep God at a distance, is to reduce his claim upon us. The second reason we might choose rules and religious systems, we might put our hope in them, is because we want to promote ourselves, or we want to show that we're doing okay. We want to give ourselves some solid ground on which we can stand and say, yep, I'm getting enough of this right. I might be making some mistakes, but I'm getting more things right than I'm getting wrong. We want to be able to assess ourselves. We want to be able to analyze ourselves and see how we're getting on. And so we treat religion sometimes as a kind of tick sheet, which we can measure ourselves against. And so this is how you might do that. You might say, I had my quiet time this morning. Tick. Or perhaps I had a quiet time at some point this week, or maybe I've had a quiet time once. Tick. And you tick it off. Or I did talk to somebody about Jesus today. Tick. Or I have read a Christian book. There's one in front of me, actually. I have read a Christian book this week. Tick. Or, you know, I said an arrow prayer and possibly it was even answered. I'll tick that one off. Or I've put something in the offering this week. I'll tick that off. Or, you know, I've taken up what feels like the right stance on some big issue in society at the moment, and tick as well. And we give ourselves a pat on the back. You know, I'm not perfect, but I'm doing okay. It's almost like we want to use a tick sheet as a sort of guarantee to help us sleep so that we don't need to lie awake at night wondering if we're going to get into heaven or not. We tick all these things that we've done as a way of saying we're doing fine. And actually, maybe what we mean is we're doing fine without God. Worse still, we use a whole bunch of religious rules and check ourselves off against them as a form of divine sanction, so that we're saying, this is the life I'm living, but look, God says it's okay. God says I'm doing fine. It's as if God is endorsing us and all of our choices, or as if we're foreclosing the judgment that God's going to make upon us at the end of time. So we might use a whole bunch of religious rules as a kind of self-assessment, but there's a Bible word for that self-assessment. Do you remember what it is? The Bible calls it self-righteousness. And actually, we're not to invest ourselves in self-righteousness. We're not to measure ourselves against a whole bunch of rules. We're not to be ticking off that sheet. What do we do instead? Well, we're to live in the grace of God. We're not to look to ourselves and see if we're doing okay. Instead, we're just to say, no, I'm a sinner in need of grace. You know, you can't shine a whole bunch of half-hearted actions in the hope that it might come out better. The point is, we are to throw ourselves into the arms of Jesus. We don't rely on any of our past successes or anything we can tick off on that sheet. Instead, we rely on his righteousness. We throw ourselves into his arms of grace. So I think sometimes we're drawn to rule keeping, to doing everything by the book, because we want to keep a clean conscience. But the truth is, the only way to have a clean conscience is through the blood of Jesus. We can never have a righteousness on our own. The righteousness that we have is the one gifted to us from him. So if you want to know this morning if you're doing okay or not, actually, in truth, you can't really know. If you feel the need to defend yourself, or if you feel like you want to judge yourself leniently, no, just remember God is the judge and God's not mocked. He has the final word on who we are and how we're doing, which sounds a bit terrifying, but of course the thoroughly good news is that we actually don't need to worry about our performance, because God has already hidden us in the righteousness of Jesus. God is not judging you on anything at all apart from on the sinlessness of his Son. So if we want to follow Jesus authentically this morning, then we're not to rely on our successes or our strengths. We're not to take the high moral ground ever. We're not to ever think of ourselves as better than others. We just depend on the righteousness of Jesus. So following Jesus is not about finding a comfortable place beyond judgment or taking pride in how far we've come. Following Jesus is about depending on him in every moment for our life and godliness. We mustn't be tempted to weigh ourselves. We must depend on God's mercy. So are you with me? We might choose a religious system. We might put our hope in that. We might rather have a tick sheet or a bunch of rules to keep God distant, to reduce his claim on us, or because we have in us this desire, this drive to find out if we're doing okay or not. And actually, it's never a very helpful drive. And why it's most unhelpful is because you might be looking at that tick sheet and there's hardly any ticks. And maybe you've come here this morning and you're thinking, I'm just not good enough. I can't prove myself. I haven't done enough for God. Jesus is never going to accept me. Look at the state of my life. Because the really good news is it never depended on that. It always depended on the grace of God shown us in Jesus, what Jesus has done for us in our place, so that we're called into the love that the Father has for the Son, not because of anything worthy in ourselves, but because the Father chooses to gift us with the Son's righteousness. So the story that we read about this leader of the synagogue chained up in his religion, it's not a story for us to read and then point our finger at him and say, you idiot, you missed it. But actually, it's maybe a story about us too, and about how we use religion to keep God at a safe distance and to make ourselves look okay. And so rather than putting on that fluorescent jacket of rules, maybe rather than doing something that makes us feel and look important, instead we put on the righteousness of Jesus. Rather than that partly filled in tick sheet, we throw ourselves on the mercy of Jesus. Rather than trying to keep God at arm's length because we got a sense of how much he might ask of us, we turn to him and we give ourselves to him vulnerably, openly. Because the truth is, if we depend on religion, if we depend on legalism, if we depend on that tick sheet, if we depend on those rules, what will happen to us? Well, we could get all of those things right even. And we could, like that synagogue leader, we could miss that God is stood in front of us, doing something wonderful and new and life-giving, calling us into life in a miraculous way. So it's an invitation for us this morning, isn't there? And the invitation is to give up all forms of self-assessment and instead throw yourself into the unimaginably great mercy of God. Give up trying to defend yourself. Don't strive, don't become legalistic, don't tie yourself in religious knots, because the truth is you've already been given mercy in Jesus. And so we already get to live in him and in his righteousness. He's already invited us to rest in his grace and his mercy and his forgiveness. And we don't need to be afraid, like the reading said, because we've not come to something that can't be touched. We've not come to that great blazing fire. We've not come to the darkness and the gloom and the tempest. We've come to God in Jesus, who is love. We've come to Jesus, who's the mediator of a better covenant. And yes, Jesus might ask of you difficult things, but he will help you give whatever he's asking you to give. So I invite you this morning, as we think about communion, as we come to communion, I invite you to come to Jesus undefended and receive his grace, not needing to prove yourself, but receiving his love and his forgiveness. Come to Jesus in surrender, trusting him and allowing him to ask anything of us. Because I don't know about you, but I don't want a rule book. I want a relationship with a living God. I don't want to worry about completing a religious tick sheet. I want to dive into the mercy of Jesus. I don't want to keep God at arm's length. I want to come to him again, vulnerable, dependent upon him. Jesus has set you free from religious rules. Jesus has set you free from a religion of self-justification, so that you can come to God unhindered and follow him wholeheartedly and not miss the miraculous things he's doing in the world. Amen.